Most census stories begin with counting the living. This one begins with numbers that refuse to explain themselves. In the mid-20th century, federal census records quietly reported population growth in parts of rural America where no such growth could be easily seen. According to surviving documents, entire enumeration districts appeared to gain residents on paper without leaving clear traces in schools, hospitals, or housing records. The numbers were accepted, archived, and folded into official history. This investigation looks not at scandal, but at silence. Archived census ledgers suggest hundreds of individuals were recorded in a region where longtime residents recall empty classrooms and unchanged neighborhoods. Budget appropriations rose. Maps were redrawn. Yet parallel records, court filings, church registers, and land deeds tell a quieter, more restrained story. The question is not whether people were invented, miscounted, or temporarily misclassified. Records suggest something more subtle, a bureaucratic reality that drifted away from physical evidence, then hardened into fact through repetition. Using surviving census schedules, county documents, and secondary local accounts, this documentary examines how official records can create populations that exist convincingly on paper while leaving little trace on the ground. What follows is not an accusation, but an examination. Not a revelation, but a careful walk through what the records show and what they never quite manage to explain. By the time the federal census reached this rural region in the early 1940s, the process itself was well rehearsed. Enumerators moved methodically along assigned routes, guided by printed maps and handwritten instructions. According to surviving census manuals, accuracy depended as much on compliance and estimation as on direct verification. In areas where households were scattered and records were thin, enumerators were often instructed to rely on local guidance and prior schedules. Archived census ledgers from this period suggest a steady rise in population across several enumeration districts. The figures appear orderly and consistent, recorded in ink, totaled at the bottom of each page, and signed off by supervisory clerks. At first glance, nothing in the paperwork signals an irregularity. The numbers align internally, they move upward at a plausible rate. According to surviving documents, the data passed through county offices and into federal summaries without objection. Yet, when examined closely, the population increase appears oddly detached from context. The region lacked major industry, had seen no documented housing expansion, and showed no corresponding surge in agricultural output or employment records. Still, the census totals climbed. Records suggest that growth was distributed evenly rather than concentrated, a pattern that often draws little scrutiny in aggregate reports. Enumeration district descriptions offer few clues. Addresses are sometimes vague, marked only by road names or landmarks that no longer appear on modern maps. In several cases, household counts rise while dwelling counts remain unchanged. According to archived materials, this discrepancy was noted only in the margins, never formally challenged. What makes these figures endure is not their strangeness, but their acceptance. Once recorded, the numbers were copied into summary tables, then abstracted again into regional reports. Each step removed them further from the original door-to-door count. By the time they appeared in printed census volumes, they had become statistics, clean, authoritative, and difficult to question. Records suggest that no single decision created the anomaly. Rather, the count appears to have accumulated through routine actions, assumptions carried forward, estimates repeated, and totals confirmed because they resembled what was expected to be seen on paper.
According to surviving documents, there was no mechanism designed to reconcile census growth with the quieter signals of daily life. At this stage in the record, the story contains no accusation and no clear error, only numbers, confidently written, beginning a narrative that would shape how the region was understood for decades to come.
Once the census numbers were finalized, their influence extended quickly into county operations and regional planning. According to surviving county records, population figures were directly cited in budget allocations, school funding, and infrastructure planning. Ledger entries from the early 1940s indicate increased appropriations for road maintenance and public works, seemingly proportionate to the rising population totals in the census ledgers. Maps were redrawn to accommodate projected growth, and planning documents referenced these statistics as authoritative, guiding decisions that would shape the county for decades. School boards relied heavily on the census-derived totals. Archived minutes suggest that class sizes and teacher appointments were determined in part by the official population counts. Yet surviving school attendance records tell a quieter story. Classrooms remained largely the same size, and the number of enrolled students did not correspond to the surge implied in the federal data. According to local archival notes, this discrepancy went largely unchallenged at the time, as planners assumed the census accurately reflected residents, even if they were not immediately visible. Similarly, county health offices and hospitals adjusted staffing and resource allocations based on the reported population. Surviving intake logs, however, indicate little change in patient numbers or disease incidence. Records suggest that while administrative systems responded to rising totals, the lived experience of the community did not match the statistical projections. Officials appear to have treated the data as reliable rather than interrogating the mismatch between paperwork and reality. Even local infrastructure projects such as road widening or water system improvements were influenced by these numbers. Archival planning maps show proposed expansions that aligned with census-based population projections. Yet follow-up records and aerial surveys from the period suggest that many of these projects were delayed, scaled back, or never implemented. In some cases, survey lines were drawn over undeveloped land, reflecting assumptions about growth rather than the tangible presence of households. What emerges from these records is a subtle but persistent phenomenon: census data shaping policy and planning long after its connection to actual population had grown tenuous. According to surviving documents, decisions were made on the assumption that the numbers were accurate, creating a bureaucratic reality that reinforced itself through repetition. The figures became not just statistics, but tools that influenced schools, budgets, and infrastructure, leaving behind a pattern of administrative actions that documented a population that may never have existed in full. By the end of this period, the numbers had left a lasting imprint. They became embedded in official reports, maps, and budgets, shaping how the county was understood by both contemporary officials and later historians, even as the disconnect between records and reality quietly endured. As the census figures continued to circulate through official channels, their authority went largely unquestioned. Yet, according to surviving documents, a quieter set of records existed alongside them, records that did not align as neatly. These materials were not hidden or classified. They were simply filed elsewhere, maintained by institutions whose daily operations reflected lived presence rather than statistical projection. Court dockets from the 1940s and early 1950s suggest stability rather than growth. The number of civil cases, jury summonses, and property disputes remained consistent with earlier decades. According to archived summaries, there was no noticeable increase in legal activity that might be expected from a rising population. The records neither contradict the census directly nor support it. They simply continue, unchanged. Church registers tell a similar story. Baptism and burial records from several congregations show minor year-to-year variation, but no sustained increase. According to surviving parish books, the number of new families entering these congregations remained limited. Local accounts later noted that pews were rarely filled beyond their usual capacity. These observations, while anecdotal, are echoed across multiple denominations whose records were kept independently of county administration. Land and housing records add another layer of complexity. County deed books indicate few new transfers during the period of reported growth. Archived materials suggest that while parcels were surveyed and reclassified, ownership patterns remained stable. Housing inspections where they occurred did not document a rise in occupied dwellings. In several cases, household counts increased on census sheets while the number of physical structures did not. Hospital intake logs provide perhaps the clearest contrast. According to surviving records, patient admissions fluctuated seasonally but showed no long-term upward trend. Staffing levels remained consistent, and there is little evidence of expanded facilities or emergency capacity. Records suggest that healthcare administrators planned cautiously, responding more to observable demand than to abstract population totals. What becomes evident is not a single contradiction, but a pattern of parallel documentation. The census described one reality, institutional records described another. According to archived correspondence, there was no formal process for reconciling these differences. Each system trusted its own data, operating within separate administrative lanes. By the time these discrepancies might have become visible in aggregate, the census numbers had already been absorbed into higher-level summaries. They existed at a scale too large to be easily challenged by localized records. What remained at the ground level were documents that quietly persisted, unchanged, unaligned, and largely unconsulted. This portion of the record offers no resolution. Instead, it shows how multiple versions of reality can coexist within official archives, each internally consistent, yet fundamentally disconnected from the others. As attention slowly turned back toward the census figures in later years, researchers encountered an unexpected obstacle: the archive itself. According to surviving finding aids, not all original census materials from this period were still intact. Some enumeration schedules referenced in indexes could no longer be located. Others survived only as summarized tables, stripped of the household-level detail that might have clarified how the numbers were first assembled. Archived correspondence from county offices suggests that portions of the records were consolidated during routine storage reviews. Handwritten notes indicate that space limitations, duplication policies, and evolving archival standards led to the removal of what were considered redundant materials. At the time, there appears to have been little concern that these documents might one day be needed for close scrutiny. Records suggest the underlying assumption was that the summaries were sufficient. The gaps are not dramatic, but they are precise. Enumeration district maps survive, yet the associated address lists do not. Population totals are preserved, while the individual entries that produced them are missing. According to archived materials, this pattern repeats across multiple years, making it difficult to reconstruct how certain districts arrived at their reported counts. In some cases, alterations are visible rather than absent. Marginal notes appear on surviving sheets, written in different ink and handwriting than the original entries. Totals are crossed out and rewritten. According to archival annotations, these changes were likely made during verification or tabulation, but no explanatory memos accompany them. The intent behind the revisions remains undocumented. County deed books, school rolls, and hospital logs from the same years are comparatively complete, their continuity highlighting the absence within the census record. Researchers attempting cross-references find themselves moving between intact local documents and federal summaries that lack their foundational layers. Records suggest that once the census data was abstracted upward, the original context became less critical to preserve. What emerges is not evidence of deliberate concealment, but of institutional routine. Archival practices favored efficiency and final totals over process and traceability. According to surviving documents, there was no standardized requirement to maintain every draft, worksheet, or preliminary schedule indefinitely. By the time historians began to question the population figures in detail, the trail had already thinned. What remained were polished tables, official reports, and numbers that could no longer be easily challenged at their source. The absence itself became part of the story, not as proof of error, but as a reminder of how historical records are shaped as much by what is discarded as by what is kept. This section underscores essential tension of the investigation. When documentation fades unevenly, certainty becomes difficult to recover, and unanswered questions are left embedded quietly within the archive. By the time the discrepancies became visible to later researchers, the census figures had already settled into permanence. They had been cited in reports, reproduced in state summaries, and absorbed into historical tables that described the region's mid-century growth. According to surviving documents, no formal review was ever initiated to reconcile the differences between federal counts and local institutional records. The numbers remained as they were first published, official, stable, and rarely revisited. What endures is not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet divergence. Census ledgers describe a community expanding in measured increments. Court dockets, school rolls, church registers, and hospital logs suggest continuity instead. Each record system appears internally consistent. The tension arises only when they are placed side by side. Archived materials indicate that once data moved upward into regional and national summaries, its foundation became increasingly abstract. Totals replaced names. District lines replaced households. Over time, the practical need to question those foundations diminished. Planning decisions were made, budgets were justified, historical narratives were written. According to surviving county documents, later administrators inherited the numbers as settled fact, not as provisional estimates. There is no surviving memorandum admitting error, nor any conclusive proof of fabrication. Records suggest something more ordinary, a series of routine decisions, estimates carried forward, summaries preserved while underlying details thinned. In that process, a statistical portrait may have grown slightly detached from the ground it claimed to measure. The unresolved question is not whether people were invented, but how administrative systems respond when small inconsistencies accumulate unnoticed. When documentation fades unevenly, when some records are complete and others fragmentary, certainty becomes difficult to reconstruct. What remains are traces. Crossed-out totals, missing schedules, steady classrooms, unchanged hospital admissions. In the end, the census numbers still stand in official tables. They continue to shape how the region is described in demographic histories of the period. Yet alongside them persist the quieter records, suggesting a more stable landscape than the federal totals imply. This investigation does not close with accusation or conclusion. It ends with a recognition that historical archives are not static vaults of certainty. They are living collections shaped by process, preservation, and omission. According to surviving documents, the census counted a population that existed convincingly on paper. Whether it existed in equal measure beyond the page remains a question the archive no longer fully answers.